Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Amy, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Amy Milne-Smith. I'm an associate professor of history at Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada. And I'm a British historian by training. And most recently, I've written a book called Out of His Mind, which is about male mental illness in the 19th century.
How'd you get interested into looking into male mental illness?
It actually started a long time ago when I was preparing for comprehensive exams for my PhD, where you have to read 200 books of various types in various subjects. And I came across this very famous book by Elaine Showalter called The Female Malady, which is all about women and madness in the 19th century. And this idea that madness was very feminized and that women were kind of the icons of mental illness for the 19th century, for better and for worse. And I thought that was really interesting. But she also made some statements that basically, like, they only discovered male mental illness on the battlefields of the First World War. And I thought, that doesn't seem quite right. And her statistics about who was in lunatic asylums, again, I thought, that doesn't seem quite right. But I was working on another project at the time. So basically, I had to put it on the back burner. And so I kept kind of reading about it in my spare time and thinking, who's done work on this? And just found there wasn't a lot, not by historians at least. So that led me to, I'm one of those people who, if there's a thread, I want to find the end of it. And the idea of finding something that hasn't been talked about a lot in the 19th century is actually pretty rare. So it's amazing how much great work had been done on women and mental illness in the 19th century. And I think that it just, looking at men as opposed to just, institutional histories of asylums, really hadn't been part of the conversation. And I think it was an important prehistory to know that, we didn't first start talking about men and mental illness in the First World War, and that it's often a kind of period of remembering and then forgetting that happens over and over again.
Well, it was always told to kind of bottle up your feelings. I remember I saw my grandfather drive a nail through his hand on accident, and he just kind of made a, and then just clear face and just gave me a head nod and walked away. I was like, what the hell was that? My grandma would just say, oh, he was in the war. So he gave me a little bit of backstory about his life. And I'm just like, so repressing your feelings, which isn't my generation. My generation, I think we're a lot more open to talking about that, which is good. But I think that evidence is from a lot of with World War I and all that, it's come of PTSD kind of brought it really noticeable in the forefront, where you really couldn't just not talk about it. You just had these episodic bursts. But I'm curious to how far back did it really start? Or at least when did we, I guess, have more evidence on it, when it wasn't just you can look up pictures of people with lobotomies, and most of them are male patients that are getting lobotomies in the pictures I've seen. With Walter Friedman, at least, I've seen males.
Most women. Most
Really?
were actually women. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. Housewives.
Why housewives?
Well, there was this idea, if you look at feminist scholars, they'll say, well, this was a way of kind of controlling and oppressing women, which in the 1950s, it's hard to argue with. But there's also the sense of if you look at who has more power in a family, it's easier to lobotomize or to force treatment without consent on women and children rather than male heads of household. So men's mental illness often had to be more extreme in order for people to get involved.
So what extreme cases will we be talking about with male mental illness?
So what's interesting in the 19th century is that they introduced asylums across Britain and also in America and Canada and throughout Europe, kind of as a public health movement, which seems very strange given the reputation Victorian asylums have, but actually it's kind of the first nationalized health option that was free And it was considered to be necessary because in the 19th century, they thought, aha, we know how to treat mental illness now. It's not about locking people up in chains and beating them. We need to show them care and concern, put them in clean clothes and clean house with lots of air and windows. And we will, provide moral treatment for them and they will get better. So for a man to be institutionalized, or a woman, if you were poor, you basically were identified, you went through the workhouse system, so the kind of for destitution, or violence is sadly another path to the asylum. So someone commits an act of violence, they find at the trial that they're mentally ill. That's one way to the asylum. If they were wealthy, you had to get 2 independent doctors to sign off on it. And because there was a concern that for private care, there was a monetary motive, perhaps. So the kind of the idea that relatives would want to lock up someone who was maybe eccentric or causing shame to the family, but they weren't really mad, and that the mad doctor would make money off of them. Wrongful confinement is the thing they're worried about for the wealthy. But for the poor, that wasn't really a concern, because the state doesn't want to treat someone if they don't have to, because it costs money, right?
That's kind of dark. I know it's real, but it's just like saying it out loud like that is dark.
Yeah. Well, but I think I teach a history of madness class, and a lot of my students often have a lot of preconceptions about 19th century madness, which I find fascinating because they don't about earlier periods. But for the 19th century, I think they have this idea of like, oh, the mad woman in the attic, whose awful husband locks her up because he wants a new wife or he wants whatever. And that's it. That's the end of the story. And I always say, well, like, that maybe did happen occasionally. We don't have to look far to find horrible examples. But there also are a lot of other kinds of stories that you find when you actually look at asylum archives, when you look at the stories of people who were in care. And some of them were absolutely very ill. And to pretend that everyone who was in a Victorian asylum wasn't really mentally ill and that it was some kind of like social construction. I don't know. I think that takes away from people's struggle, from people's suffering, because you often hear quotations, the doctors write down what patients say, and they were really suffering from these symptoms that they couldn't control, that were damaging their lives, right? And they didn't have anything basically in their toolkit to help them, apart from clean air, a fresh linens, that sort of stuff. So I think you have to approach it with a lot of empathy and not put our modern assumptions onto it.
Some simple things, like, just some conclusions that I have from them. You can correct me if I'm wrong as well too, but there's like, I always, when I talk to someone with ADHD or someone who's an ADHD expert, they'll talk about like that's a mental illness. So I'm like, well, hang on a second, there's a more severity on a scale of like what's mental illness. I don't consider my ADHD, it sucks that sometimes you can't get sleep, but my friend's mom was schizophrenic and ended up taking her own life. That's a severe mental illness that should be looked at and should be diagnosed as such. And I feel like it devalues that mental illness, when we start, I don't want to say you have to put levels on it, but it's, in a sense, there's like things that should be more looked at closely, not as like a danger to other people, but a danger to themselves as well too, and give them more. I would put them as probably a bigger priority than me just trying to calm down for 5 seconds.
Yeah, it's funny that we have trouble doing that with mental illness. We have no trouble doing that with physical illness, right? We have enormous empathy and understand the severity of someone dealing with stage 4 cancer, and then someone who cut their hand slicing a bagel. They're both real illnesses. They're both real problems. But like, we recognize that, okay, they're going to be triaged differently. They're going to be treated differently. They both are real, and they both are causing that person concern, obviously, but it's different levels. And I think it's the same. Most scholars of the reason we call it madness, the history of madness, and not anything else, is because we realize it is a spectrum. It's constantly changing over time. What is considered significant and not, what is considered mental illness or not, actually changes over time, and what the boundaries of those diseases are, which I think is hard for us to understand, because we want to say, well, if it's a real disease, it has categories, it has a diagnosis. And if it's not that, then maybe it's not as real. But all diseases are constructions in one way or another. We're always learning new things about them. And so it shouldn't kind of surprise us that now, as in the past, we're always making these decisions about what is troubling and what is not. My students always want to retro-diagnose the past. And that's my one lesson that I teach in the class is like, you can do that in other classes, your psych classes, that's fine. But as historians, what we want to do is understand people on their own terms, like see what they were dealing with, see how they would have understood symptoms or not symptoms. Like the idea of having visions from God, that Jesus could come visit you on your bed and talk to you in the medieval period would not have been considered strange. That wouldn't have been considered a hallucination. You were divinely, inspired, and you got this wonderful miracle vision. As long as you weren't a heretic, that was great. It wasn't a symptom of mental illness. So Joan of Arc, in all of her trials, no one thought she was mentally ill. People today, and let's face it, if she had those exact same experiences today, it might be understood differently, right?
Well, there's like a homeless guy down the street from me he speaks all the time about like religious prophecies and apocalypses and stuff. And damn it, if he's not convincing sometimes, because sometimes I'm like, yo, he could be a leader of a cult if he really tried, because he's just, whether it's a good talker or whatever it is, but he ends up having this personality that hooks people in a sense too. But yeah, we look at that completely different today. We just see him as like a crazy person and just walk off with our day and don't think about him again. But then back then, people would have just worshipped a person that was speaking that they were like the son of God. Or I'm not hitting religion here. I'm just saying
no.
The more religious beliefful aspect. It's just weird to see that evolution over time.
Yeah, they had a very different worldview. They just saw the world differently. It's all about defining what is normal, and what is normal has changed a lot over time. I always tell my students, at any point, any one of us in the past probably could have been diagnosed as mad. I always say the example, I am a woman with a PhD teaching to a group full of men and women. Like that would have been considered at many points in history really bizarre and problematic and not allowed. So, even things that we now consider normal might have been pathologized in the past, and vice versa. Yeah, things we pathologize now, they didn't.
Now, was this a easier transition, I guess, to ease social context or social problems that were going on back then by calling somebody mad, whether it's like simple? Because honestly, if I look through like the history of madness and I kind of see a lot of examples that get brought up between people, I go, are they just mistaking things for emotion? And then sometimes, I mean, you could even probably lump in some categories of just people just trying to get rid of a problem or get rid of something that they just don't necessarily understand. And maybe that's me retro diagnosing, I guess, with today's time period. But there's like a lot of things that easily bipolar or any of these types of things that we have medications for now. And yeah, we have a way to treat them, but they would have been quick, like lobotomy or insane asylum in some of those cases.
Well, I mean, the funny thing about the history of madness is it gets worse before it gets better. So my period is actually, if we have to time travel, and I'm saying if, because it'd be terrible. If you have a mental illness, you want to live now, not at any other point in history, as bad as it might be. But if I had to choose between a Victorian asylum and an asylum in the 1950s, I choose the 19th century every time.
Really?
Because they didn't have the dangerous tools that come up in the 20th century, right? In the 20th century, it's the age of heavy air quotes, heroic psychiatry, which is where they started experimenting with ECT at very high levels, insulin coma therapy, lobotomies. They were trying these desperate remedies, eugenic practices, right? That's all 20th century. In the 19th century, you were put in a big asylum. Maybe, let's say it's a working class asylum, so worst case scenario, it's overcrowded. But the doctors in their toolkit, all they've got is alcohol and opium. They can't do the kind of damage that was done in the 20th century. Now, they didn't have any other good tools either. They didn't have psychotherapy. They didn't have therapy of any kind. They basically had, well, kind of like an early occupational therapy. Like you'd go out and work on the farm if you were able to, fresh air, walking, exercise. But, I'll take that over a lobotomy.
Yeah.
7 days out of the week, right?
Well, do you think it's they just got sick of trying to do a more slow paced way of trying to solve the mental illness thing? Maybe because of overcrowding and some of those aspects that started happening where you start getting the lobotomy as another form of more effective treatment. I mean, eventually that starts becoming like the main form of treatment when you start looking at like other alternative ways. I think now we explore more alternative therapies when it comes to mental illness, but obviously we don't use lobotomies every day. But I mean, Walter Friedman was touring around and just like giving people lobotomies openly. So I just start going, I mean, eventually you get kind of sick of trying to handle the problem and you just try and find a more effective way, which sadly at the time was a lobotomy or was electroconvulsive therapy as well.
Well, I think what happens is, so there's a long history here. So in the Enlightenment in the 18th century, Enlightenment usually has a good reputation. Age of Light, Age of Reason, all these philosophers in Germany
I
kind of
think of
sitting
a
around
book.
thinking, yeah. But in terms of mental health, it's actually a very dark time because they prioritize reason so much, because the reason becomes the defining focus of humanity. Unlike before, which religion was like, it's the light of God, the spark of God, that's what makes you human. In the Enlightenment, they're like, no, it's reason. Reason is this amazing thing we have that no one else has. But the problem is, if you don't have reason, if you are mad, if you cannot reason, then you are less than a human. You are like an animal. And they did not treat animals very well in the 18th century. And so, in a sense, in the medieval worldview, you could never lose that light of God, even if you were a raving lunatic. But in the Enlightenment, you could. And so it was a really dark time. That's when they really just locked people up in chains and threw away the key. In the 19th century, you get this advent of this new idea of moral treatment. We're going to take off the chains. We're going to have clean asylums. We're going to take people out of basements and take people out of locked up in barns. And they had enormous hope. They had hope that they could cure people with basically just treating them nicely and kind of like coaxing their sanity back. And so that era of hope goes throughout the 19th century. And then in the late 19th century, they start to worry a bit. They start to get nervous a bit. In the First World War, they start to get very nervous. And it's at this turning point into the 20th century where you get the hope lost of the power of psychiatry. And so they start looking in new directions. So that's where you get the neurologists, you get the brain surgeons coming to the forefront with kind of desperate measures, right? So it's the creation of this belief that around the 20th century that the asylum system has failed. This old 19th century idea didn't work. We need something more radical. It's a belief that madness lives in the brain, that it's not kind of psychological, that of course there's a whole Freud that's a different path, but there's these group of what they call somatic psychiatrists who really believe madness is in the brain. So if we can just fix it in the brain, then we can fix madness. They're looking for the miracle pill, right? The miracle cure. And this is the era, remember, where they like invent things like penicillin. So, in the medical sciences of physical illness, they're having all these massive breakthroughs. And so I think what happens with the 20th century psychiatry is they get both desperate and also very confident. And they start doing things that are to us kind of horrific and unimaginable. But I think you have to imagine their time and place of like, they really were, first of all, way too confident. History of science is always bad when doctors are really confident. It leads to mistakes. And they also were seeing these asylums just fill up with people who were there for the rest of their lives. And so lobotomies, as brutal as they sound to us, what they did is they got people home. People who were unmanageable, who were violent, who were hurting themselves, trying to hurt other people. They were sometimes lobotomized, and then they became passive. They weren't the same person that they were before their illness, but they could leave the asylum. And that was seen as a victory. Because you wonder, like, when you look at these things, how did they ever justify these people being cured? And that's how. If they could leave the asylum, they considered that a win.
Yeah, I think now we know with hindsight, at least the task was to just leave the asylum or get them out of there. But if you look at what the damage was that was done, was the fact that you took away this person's emotion, you took away this person's personality in a sense. I mean, there's interviews out there you can find of people that are after a lobotomy and they just sound like someone has just dumbed them down to like level one, and they just can't express themselves in any way. I mean, if your concern is to get the person home, I would think that if they were doing lobotomies at the time, would they even have continued to keep doing them if they would have looked at the alternative effect of like what happens to this person afterwards? Yeah, you cure the violence and stuff, but is that person able to live a fulfilled life?
Well, that's why it doesn't take off everywhere. So I've read interviews in Sweden with people who were, lobotomy was available as a tool everywhere around the world, but different countries took it up at different rates. And I mean, there were critics of Walter Freeman in America. There were some people who thought he was a miracle worker, and there were people who thought he was a monster, even at the time. But I think that the desperation people had for any sort of glimmer of hope lured people in and made them, more open. And then, of course, that's why I say, like, the 19th century just didn't have these problems. They didn't have the worst you were going to get in the 19th century is to be placed in an asylum when you don't think you should be there. And I'm not saying that isn't terrible. That is terrible. But at least the doctors aren't going to cut into your brain.
Yeah. Who was at the forefront of that early 19th century asylum? Those people that were looking at an alternative method of like, let's bring out, open up the windows and everything and have kind of this open space. I mean, was that just because there was a lot of strong faith in the medicine that they had at the time, like opium and things that they were going to be using? Or was there really this revolutionary thinking of like, holy crap, we've been chaining people in basements and we kind of need to change this a little bit?
It's interesting because in France, it comes out of the medical and asylum movement, well, a little bit, but in Britain, it actually comes from the Quakers. So it's a religious group. The Quakers are the big reformers, they're the ones who are against slavery in the early 19th century, at least, and are kind of social reformers. And so as one of their kind of social issues, they look at asylums and they see people who are being chained up for 20 years who, just forgotten about and treated poorly. And they, again, from a religious background, they're like, these are human beings. They have the light of God, right? And we should be treating them better. And so they set up model asylums where basically the patients live with them like a family. They have meals together. They're given like a little cottage. It's very small, very personal, very one-on-one. And they seem to have enormous success with this. And basically what happens is the medical establishment is like, hang on, we want to make sure that we're in charge of the MAD because we're doctors. They have mental illness. We should be the ones in charge of it. So they kind of take up moral treatment, partially because they do believe that what they were doing in the past was wrong, but also partially they don't want to miss out. They're like, we should be the ones doing it. Thank you. You've done a nice job and everything, but you need experts in control of the care. And they go whole hog. So sometimes, the new ideas can be very beneficial, and it happens incredibly quickly. They set up legislation setting up asylums across the nation. They set up the rules of how to be institutionalized, and they basically create it as a social requirement that the state is required to offer asylum care. Now, the flip side of this, the dark side, is there also is the belief in the 19th century that the MAD need to be in asylums for their own sake and for the sake of the community. There really is a desire to take people out of their homes and their families, and that the best thing you can do with the MAD is send them to an asylum. It's almost like an isolation hospital, right? It's as if they have tuberculosis or something that, we want to get them out. And they say this is done for the benefit of the patient, but historians also wonder, is this also done because the community, there's stigma, that you don't want them anymore?
There's a tie-in with eugenics I started to notice when I talked to some people who study kind of like the history of madness a little bit, but I would just feel like it would be a fear aspect. You would want to isolate that person away from the rest of the community because of, I don't know, damage to others and fear of that sort. But also, I think that comes with just understanding it more too, because you could just say that someone is mad and then you can call on your neighbor and then get your neighbor locked up in an insane asylum. Have you ever tried explaining to someone you're not insane? Like, if you're in an insane asylum, it's impossible.
Except the flip side of that is the state doesn't want to institutionalize you, right? Because it costs money. So your neighbor, you're a butcher, and your neighbor says he's mad. The state has no interest in locking you up because If you're on your own, you're free, you're not costing them anything. If I have to institutionalize you, it costs money. And it costs more money to put you in an insane asylum than it does to put you in the workhouse. Because the workhouse is what you do with destitute people, people who are what they call paupers, people who have no money, no jobs, nowhere to live. They are sent to the workhouse. And it's a lot cheaper to keep someone in a workhouse than in an asylum. So if you are diagnosed as mad within the workhouse, it's probably going to be a pretty extreme high bar for that, because they'd much rather keep you in the workhouse if they can.
When it came to closing down like institutions, I mean, was that if is that was a money thing, or was that just a public outcry of people wanting to understand the madness a little bit more?
So in the mid 20th century, when they start closing asylums, it's kind of two big things. First, it's the advent of antipsychotic drugs, which were first dubbed chemical lobotomies. So you see the time period we're in. So antipsychotic drugs were the actual breakthrough they'd been looking for with those heroic surgeries, where people who had been, violent and heard voices all of a sudden didn't, or at least could go home again. The other was a reaction against all of those abuses within psychiatry, the overcrowded asylums with no care being given. There were a series of exposés about the state of asylums in the mid 20th century. There also is the rise of the anti-psychiatry movement, where people start to question doctors' power. They start to really kind of resist against all of this stuff. There's a litany of crimes that can be pointed to. And they say, why should you be in charge of this? Why should everyone who's mentally ill be in an asylum? Because you aren't doing anything for them anyway. So there's this kind of pushback against the asylum and these new tools, and just this belief that treatment without consent is more of a problem in the 20th century than it was beforehand. The idea that if someone doesn't want to be treated, you cannot force them. And so all of those things kind of come together and shift the conversation. And what's amazing is how quickly the asylums empty out. For, basically it's a 200-year thing. They rise over 100 years, and then it's 150 years, really, the age of the asylum.
I don't agree with a lot of the actions that some of these asylums were doing too, but we also didn't have a place to put people that left those asylums as well too. Like, no one really thought about that. They were more, I mean, it's hard. You're upset because you see what was going on in a lot of these asylums, and you're just people get passionate with emotion, and they don't really think the step that comes after that. And that's where something we probably should have braced for a little bit.
Yeah, there was supposed to be community care networks set up so that people would have kind of help and support to transition. And this starts in the 60s. There is some community care. There are some attempts, but it's, as often happens, it's a budget line that's easy to cut. I know in the US, at least, Reagan had massive cuts to mental health care. And, it looks like something, it's a budget line item, sadly. It's not necessarily going to be cheaper to do good community care than it would be to do asylums. So it's, I think it sadly sometimes comes down to budgets, which is, again, I find the 19th century so fascinating, because they spend so much money on these asylums. I'm looking at an asylum right now where the Richmond Asylum was the most expensive building ever built in Ireland. They put massive resources into this, which I think demonstrates the hope they had that you don't see mimicked in the mid 20th century when they're ending asylums.
You think it's because they were viewing it more like a disease, that if they got on top of it now, or built up a system, a foundation for it now, that they would have maybe it cured or fixed by then, with that kind of aspect of hope?
The Victorians really believed in early intervention. They really thought that if you got it early and you could kind of take them, another reason they wanted to take them out of their environment is they thought that their home environment is probably what was causing problems. So if you take them out of it, and you give them good care, and frankly, for the very poor, sometimes they did see good results early on, because a lot of things that might have looked like mental illness were actually malnutrition. Like if you're literally starving and your body is not getting the nutrients that it wants, it can have a lot of different symptoms. And so, or women who had in the 19th century what they called puerperal insanity, which was a recognized form of mental illness after giving birth to children. And I wonder how many of those working class women have 6 kids already. This is their their 7th kid. They probably were absolutely exhausted, just kind of completely depleted. And you find they go to an asylum and then they're back home in 6 months or so. They probably just needed rest. And you're not going to get rest when you got 7 kids.
So when it came to like, I guess, recovery times on some of these people back in the 19th century asylums, I mean, were there a lot of improvements after people were just taken out of their home situation for a couple of months and able to return back? Like people weren't in these for extreme long periods of time, were they?
It varied wildly. So there were some people, there's a lot of people who are in and out of asylums for less than a year. There are then people who are in for a few years. And then there are, and the Victorians start understanding this, people they decide or they determine are chronic incurables. So they start to recognize as they get more experience with just vast numbers of patients that there are different types of illnesses and that some illnesses seem to respond to, general care and others do not. And so you do get this kind of separation of the early treatment, the early hope. And then if you're in an asylum, pretty much if you're in an asylum more than 5 years, you're never getting out.
How good is the documentation and archival record on some of these things? Because that's kind of a common theme throughout history is that people don't necessarily write down a lot of the bad stuff or what would be seen as bad slights of what they might look like or anything of that sort. Usually the best stuff gets talked about. That's why they say history is written by the winners.
The history of mental health is certainly not. I don't know who the winners are, though, in that story, really. I look at 19th century asylum records, and so those are, case books. So that's literally the patient's history is written down, and then you get weekly check-ins on how they're doing. It's hard to know how sanitized that is because that's all that's left. You don't have, time machine again to double check, but there are a lot of bad things recorded. They talk about when patients get into fights with each other. They talk about when an attendant has to be dismissed because he was too rough, broke a patient's ribs. They also did in Britain have an oversight committee called the Lunacy Commission. So the Lunacy Commission was in charge of regulating asylums, and they were very involved and active. So they investigated all allegations of abuse. They investigated things like if they were not spending enough money on food or sanitation. If there was a typhus outbreak, they'd be on it, and asylums could lose their license if they didn't, come up to the standards. So and of course, it's really hard to know because, of course, if you accept that some of the patients in asylums were genuinely ill, they are not always, we're very skeptical of doctors, but we also have to be skeptical of patients, that they might have genuinely believed that the walls were being, this is one patient I know, who he believed that toxic gases were being pumped through the walls and that the doctors were trying to poison him. But I
don't know about that one. I might have some belief in that just because I know some stuff that like working with like LSD and stuff like that. But
they did. But this is the 19th century. That's the thing. They didn't have that technology yet. They didn't. They can't do that.
So schizophrenia then.
Probably, or some type of that's the thing. When you are in a delusional state, it doesn't mean that what they believed wasn't real to them, but we also don't have to necessarily always just be like, oh, well, the doctors are right and the patient's lying, or the patient is lying, the doctors are right. It's a negotiation. So I do have a few cases where, for example, there was a 19th century playwright who suffered some mental illness, and then he wrote about it, actually. So there are some memoirs from patients.
Vincent van Gogh.
He writes about his experience in a lunatic asylum. And he talks about how they were cruel to him and how it was terrible. And I was never ill. That's his main takeaway. I had hypochondria, but I was never insane. But I also was able to look at the case notes of that same man. And from the doctor's point of view, at least, they did think he was seriously ill because he tried to commit suicide several times. And he glosses this over in his memoir. And so I say, you know, as a historian, I have to look at both of those stories and say the truth is somewhere in the middle of that. You know, the truth might be that this man believed he was not ill, and that was his truth. But according to the society of the day, you know, his constant attempts at self-harm that he didn't seem to remember were a problem. And even he admits his memory is fuzzy on certain things. And so it's just a difficult kind of negotiation. You want to recognize someone's experience, but also accept that it might not have been that his doctors were monsters in this case. I think they seemed to genuinely want to help him, and he did get released.
I think it's important to look at both sides of that because honestly, if you asked my opinion, if I would trust a doctor's writing down of something like that, I mean, it would depend what the form is. I see them being very, very critical and analytical. A lot of times, obviously, like a doctor should do, but more like this person will do anything to lie and do anything like this. I'm like, oh, what if you get the journal of the other person? Are they, you know, experiencing depression? Maybe that's why they're, you know, attempting to kill themselves. Obviously, if they're not mentioning it, there's a problem there as well, too. But I mean, where does that entitlement kind of, I'm not saying entitlement as in doctor's perspective, but there's like this sense of like very analytical or very like even their first thought could be like, this is the cure type mentality that is in there. And I feel like that is a problem as well, too, without just like going through more of a thorough conclusion or basis in a diagnosis.
Well, it's interesting because in the 19th century, doctors are for the first time starting to specialize in mental illness. There were no psychiatrists in the 17th century. They just didn't exist. The word didn't exist, actually, until the late 19th century. And what you find is people calling themselves alienists is the first term they use, which is a great Victorian anachronism. And they thought that if they brought rational, medical, analytic kind of study to the mentally ill, they would be able to determine who is mentally ill versus who is just kind of eccentric. So for them, the hallmarks often were delusions, hallucinations. The 19th century is very big on that. So did someone see things or hear things that were not there? Did they believe things that like fundamentally were not true? Those were the real hallmarks of mental illness, along with they are just starting to use the word depression, but they also continue to use a very old term, melancholia, which that from ancient times is this understanding of being sad in a way that does not connect to the kind of social situations around you. So like
Melancholy.
Yes. Yeah.
I know that word.
Melancholia is the old Greek one. But we still talk about melancholy today, but it used to be a formal diagnosis, was melancholia. And it was basically, if your parents died and you were sad, that's not melancholia. Melancholia was you were plagued by depression in a way that had nothing to do with your circumstances, right? They talk about, there's a great metaphor that the Brits seem to use quite a bit. They talk about melancholy as a black dog that follows you. Winston Churchill talked about that, the black dog. This idea of this kind of overwhelming sadness and despair that would just kind of crush you. Those people do end up in asylums too sometimes, but generally only after a suicide attempt. Because that's when it was considered, that's the the line. They considered suicide a proof of mental illness.
Yeah, it's well, you also want to keep the person from attempting to hurt themselves again as well, too. Yeah, I knew that word. I've heard that word before. Whether it was from like a Scrabble or some type of game I played, I've heard that word before. But I'm interested, when you look at the asylum records, are you able to, like you mentioned Ireland and kind of they're advanced about pouring money into a lot of the work into these asylums and kind of building them up. But is there any certain documents that show like based on wherever it was located, that there were people that were trying more alternative methods or maybe had a different approach to more drastic ones. I would have to think if you had an overcrowding issue that was like really severe, if you lived in a more dense population, you probably wouldn't be exploring more precautious or passive methods. You probably look to more extremes. And I would think in an area where there was less dense populations, you would probably be dealing with more of a longer time span of trying to work out maybe an appropriate method before you hit the extreme.
Well, again, in the 19th century, there aren't any extremes, right? There's just, asylums getting overcrowded. That tends to be the difference. That in, Colney Hatch Asylum, which is one of the biggest asylums in England, which is dealing with a lot of the London population. I forget what it is, but they said to like walk the hallways would take like hours to walk the one hallway of the whole hospital, because it was built on a system where there was a main building and then outbuildings. So it was like kind of a big line or like bat wings. And anytime the asylum got overcrowded, you built another. And so it was just this massive institution. So that, and the moral reformers, the people who came up with the idea of these new asylums, their argument about why their treatment maybe wasn't working, why it wasn't effective, is they always said, well, the asylums are too big. The whole idea of the Quakers and the Tukes of this family care and moral care was individualized treatment. Whereas what you get in these big London asylums isn't extreme care, it's lack of care. They see the doctor once a week for 30 seconds. They just they are warehousing the mad, is the expression that's sometimes used to describe them. They're not being cared for except their basic bodily care. And you actually see that a lot in casebooks. You'll note they talk a lot about, if a patient develops bed sores, or if they spike a fever, or if they have some kind of physical ailment, the dentist is brought in, these sorts of things. But in terms of their mental health, again, that toolkit is empty. The cupboard is bare when it comes to things that they're disposable to do to intervene. Talk therapy is a long way off. They don't have good drugs beyond, the basics of alcohol and opium. And so all they can offer is a nice environment. And they actually thought the environment would be curative. And when it isn't, they kind of say, well, we didn't get to them early enough. Or in the later 19th century, you start to get these theories of degeneration, which imply that, well, you, by your heritage, were prone to this, and therefore it's inevitable because your mother had tuberculosis and your father committed suicide. So they start looking, before eugenics, they actually start looking at family history.
That's literally like selling death, like how the whole industry of death has kind of became. I mean, they sold coffins in Costco at one point. So it's like, I don't know, that's a little bit darker down a different rabbit hole. But when it came to the environmental, I guess, influences, the opening idea of treatment by maybe changing the environment as well. I mean, did any of them pay attention to, or anybody write down anything about like what the certain cells or wherever these places were being held? Like I've learned a lot about like color therapy and things of that sort as well too. Things that were, I mean, it came a little bit earlier than I expected. I thought that was a more modern day tactic, but it seemed like there was approaches to understanding like a person's environment, such as like temperature in a room, or even, trying to find ways to be able to fix certain things to just make them more comfortable, and seeing if it would change any degree of, certainty on their madness or not.
They were obsessed with it, in fact, because
I
that's
like
something
that.
they could control, right? So they talk about, that you have to have a window in every room, but how big does it need to be? How much light do you need to have? How much fresh air do you have to have? They would always want freshly plastered walls. And then the views. They actually, if you look at a lot of 19th century asylums that still exist, because a lot of those buildings still exist, they often, if they're run down, they look kind of spooky and haunted. And we're used to those images of kind of dilapidated Victorian asylums. But the flip side is, what else happened to a lot of Victorian asylums? They've been turned into luxury flats because they were beautiful buildings. They were beautiful, huge brick, imposing spaces built in the countryside, right? They were built in the countryside with rolling hills. You were supposed to have, calming views. They were meant to be beautiful spaces.
I'm not thinking about the property value at that point. I'm like, what's the horrible demons that were in this building?
Well, but again, if it's a Victorian asylum, not as bad. 20th century, there you got trouble. But you know, a lot of people, they really did. They kind of had competitions. They had debates about what's the perfect style of asylum, what's the most calming. In the wealthier asylums, where they of course have more money to play with, they absolutely highly decorate them. Patients are allowed to bring their own decor from home. Wealthy, very wealthy patients brought their own staff with them, so their servants would come with them to the asylum, their dogs sometimes, their carriages. My favorite ever prescription I've seen in an asylum was at a very wealthy asylum where a man was prescribed 6 glasses of champagne a day, and then he was complaining about the quality of the champagne. So, you know, it's a very wide array of experiences you're going to have in these institutions.
Do you
I
have a
was thinking
lot of?
that sign me up, 6 glasses of
I
champagne.
know.
Not
I was
bad.
I was like, what is it? It's not a mansion. But do you have a lot of your students that kind of just look at like what happens if that time period, if they would have held out hope a little bit longer? Like, I mean, if we wouldn't have had this straight, like, dive into, lobotomies and things of this sort, and if we would have tried a more like open and tried to focus more on the asylum methods of maybe building a better facility and, trying to go more towards that line of treatment, would we have a whole different side of history as well too? Maybe we would understand mental health a little bit better. I mean, I'm not just totally throwing out the lobotomy aspect. I get that it was needed in some cases, sure. It's hard to justify that on ethical issues because I don't believe that you should ever give anybody a lobotomy. But like I said, I've talked to a lot of people on the madness subject, and everyone's got different varying views on that. So I'm just trying to find a balanced approach in it. But ECT, I mean, even in some places that's still being used. I don't agree with that as well either.
Yeah,
So
ECT. I mean, the sad thing is ECT, because of this, horrible reputation it got, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You think of Jack Nicholson being given ECT as a punishment, right? Or it also was frequently used for schizophrenics. It doesn't work on schizophrenics. But I think because we got this horrible, and also they used to do it without anesthesia, which is horrible. And I think that still kind of goes through people's minds. We still have these cultural hangovers of the bad old days. Whereas ECT, they were on the right track, but just slightly wrong, right? First of all, people do not need to be awake. Give them an anesthetic first. And secondly, it's apparently very successful for depression that won't, serious depression that won't respond to other treatments. But for schizophrenia, no, it's really not helping. So sometimes it's psychiatrists, they had the wrong tool, or the right tool, but using it for the wrong thing, right? A hammer works great unless you're trying to screw in something, right? Hammer only works if you're hammering.
well, they're still using that in some places as well too. I think I had Nancy, oh God, what's her blank on her last name, Judge Rotenberg Center. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. That's a real institution that's still open today. The FDA just lost a lawsuit against them, and there's a popular video you can watch from 2004 of a mentally challenged kid tied to a 4-point board, and they shocked him 136 times to the side of his head, where he had third-degree burns on the side of his head and acute stress disorder. And just because the guy's connected with a lot of court leaders or court justices or whatever you want to say, that every time they bring a lawsuit up against this place, FDA lost, a bunch of other people have lost as well too. There's a whole, it sounds conspiratorial when I say that, because like it can't be happening today, but you can look up the center and it's like, yeah, it's real. And it's like, I think the book's called Pain and Shock in America, but it's not even ECT. It's they used another form of it. They adjusted and made this new device or something like that. But I mean, it's shocking, no pun intended, to look and see that this stuff is still going on. But it's like, you can't, obviously there's bad locations everywhere, and it's not every location that does that. But that introduction of that device, whether this historical standpoint of that it being effective in the sense of whatever they were trying to see it as effective as, has this still implication as like this torch it all mentality that we've had a lot of the time.
Well, again, it's rarely about the tools. It's how we choose to use them, right? Like electric therapy of various sorts. They used it a lot in the First World War, because when shell shock was first understood, shell shock manifested very differently than what we think of as PTSD, because it was very much physical. It was facial tics and it was partial paralysis that happened a lot. And so what the doctors would do, so would have a paralyzed arm, but there was no symptoms of what had paralyzed it. They couldn't find anything physical that had done it. So they thought, oh, they had shell shock, the concussive kind of force of these shells that are being dropped on these soldiers has somehow screwed up his wiring, his nerves, or whatever. So they did electric shock to his arm. So they would literally do shocks to the arm, the paralyzed arm, in order to get motion into it again. Now that's, doesn't sound so bad. It was very gentle shocks. It was like, the muscle stimulation things they try to sell on TV, after midnight. It's this idea of like kind of recognizing that the muscles work, that the muscles can move, and that would help some men regain the use of their arm, which is great. But on the flip side, there also was this French doctor who, for men who had lost the ability to speak, he would put the electric shocks on their larynx. And the way that they describe it sounds like absolute torture. They were in absolute pain. And, that's the same tool, same philosophy, but being used very differently. One in a kind of like more spa-like cure setting, and one, you get the feeling that that doctor thought to a certain extent it was about a lack of willpower, that you just need to get over it, and you just need to kind of, stop having symptoms. There was this idea that you should be able to control your symptoms.
There's still, a mentality out there today. Like, my brother lives in that boat where he's like, ADHD's all in your head. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of the problem, but there's people that have that mentality. Like, you can just hurry up and put up a cover up over it. I'm like, yeah, in some cases you kind of can, but you disguise it. It's not a permanent fix. Like, I can manage my ADHD to a level, but it's not like, and obviously that's not a severe one compared to like paranoia or hallucinations or things of that sort. But even like, who's the guy who thought of sticking the electroconvulsive stuff to your brain? Like, have you talked to anybody that studies consciousness? They don't even know what that is. I've had plenty of consciousness researchers on here that go, your guess is as good as mine. I'm like, what? And it's like, yeah, because the brain is something that is like, we understand a lot about it, but we also don't know the full capabilities of a lot of things about that. And think someone could just shock it. It's like the time I stuck a fork into an electric socket, and then I had to count to make sure I still knew math. Like, it's a random occurrence that you might get the exact result that you're looking for, but there's so many things that can go wrong with that.
Oh yeah, but their scientific method and their ethics boundaries, if to say, were a lot broader than ours. I just learned this year in researching for the class that I teach, Benjamin Franklin did some early experiments with kind of electric therapy.
Why he had bodies in his basement.
Well, this was live people. So but it started as an accident. He shocked himself. He got a severe electric shock himself. And the next morning he said he woke up really refreshed and really, so he's like, well, I wonder if this would work on other people. And that's kind of 19th century science thinking.
And right? Then they created energy drinks. God.
Yeah, it's very they had a very different set of rules. I think that's why 20th century psychiatry is so much darker, because, for example, I lecture on the MK Ultra experiments that happened. Those are so horrific, not just because they were horrific, but also because this is after the Nuremberg laws.
Yeah.
This is after we should have known better.
Well, the Nuremberg laws, they even said it. I had Alan Hornblum on here who did about that. Oh, what is it? It's called Acres of Skin, the book about experimenting on prisoners and institutions. The Nuremberg laws, that was just for the Nazis. We deemed ourselves it didn't qualify under us.
Yeah, my students are always amazed when I say that the eugenics sterilization programs, they all expect they're going to end after the Second World War, after they discover what the Nazis did. And I was like, no, sadly, that didn't stop till the 70s.
Yeah. Live cancer cell injections, I thought that was a conspiracy for the longest time. And then I heard it in his documentary because he did a book and a documentary, and they mentioned it in Ohio penitentiary that was injecting live cancer cells. And people were like, wait, that's freaking real. And he wrote it for like the New York Post. And I was like, this sounds nuts. Like, I've never heard of anything like that before. But MK Ultra is a hot topic for me. That's one I'm specifically very interested in. Operation Midnight Climax, so much of like Joyanne West. Particularly if you notice on my show, a lot of JFK episodes, Joyanne West, that psychiatrist, is the same guy who visited Jack Ruby, but there's like just weird connections with like him all over the place. And obviously we don't have to get into all that, but that MK Ultra doctor, I'm like, that is a real program. It was ran by Alan Dulles. That went some horrible extents. I had David Talbot on here talk about that. Stephen Kinzer, who wrote Poisoner in Chief, about Sidney Gottlieb, one of the guys that was in charge of those programs. I mean, getting college professors to do, to me, like, what's the logic behind that? And there was like over 44 college institutions that were involved in that. And some of those, my friends went to those colleges. And I'm like, yeah.
I lecture, I talk about the Canadian connection. So I talk about what happened at McGill University.
I've spoken to, I think, oh, I'm going to blank on her name. Erica Dick, I think her name is. She's yeah, she talked about McGill briefly, but you guys, I only know of you and Cameron down there.
Yeah, that was him.
That was McGill?
That was McGill.
I
He
mean,
was a Scotsman who was also American. He never had Canadian citizenship, but he was the head of the School of Psychiatry of McGill.
do you think that could have went in a better direction if they wouldn't have went to maybe, I don't know what could have influenced that it got it the way it did?
I think what's so interesting is, and this has been a slow evolution, but an important one, is the idea of consent, of patients having not just consenting to something they don't understand, but consenting and being fully aware of the risks of something, right? I mean, because let's say you get a diagnosis where they say, well, there's this incredibly risky surgery we could do, and it has, only a 15% survival rate. But if we do nothing, you're 100% going to die. That person has a choice to take that 15% or not. But I think with mental health, it's so much messier and it's been so much murkier over time. Who gets to make that choice? How mentally ill does someone have to be before you can say, they really can't consent to this or not? And I think we still don't know where that line is, right? We have emergency psychiatric holds that exist in the Western world where you can be confined against your will for 78, 72 hours, 48 hours,
Care.
whatever. Exactly. And that is forced treatment. But that is for people who are supposed to hit a very, very high bar. But for those people, you cannot force them to have surgery, to have, we are going to force them to do one thing. But the idea of forcing treatment on people who don't understand, who can't understand, that is something we very slowly came to grips with being a problem. And, that's something that is a good evolution. That's a good thing that's happened. But in the past, we also, again, one thing that's been really interesting about studying the 19th century is there used to be a lot of focus on the power of doctors and the power of institutions, largely because of Foucault, but also a lot of the institutional histories. But what's really interesting is the actual power of decision-making of who gets sent to an asylum isn't doctors, it's families. It's families. Doctors aren't going door to door looking for lunatics. It's families who decide we cannot take care of this person. And sometimes it's done in a negative way. We don't want to take care of this person. And sometimes it's done out of, again, faith in the system. We can't help them. Maybe the asylum can. And so I think the role of families is something that has been really coming to the forefront, that mental health is never just a conversation between patients and doctors. It's patients, doctors, and then patients' communities, whether they're families or their circles of friends, that really form that full conversation.
There's a book I've mentioned many times about kind of mental health a little bit. It's called Cruise Control. It's about a brother's perspective of, he has a brother who's like in a wheelchair and kind of very physically and mentally disabled. Like it goes from the whole perspective from the brothers, like, he just wants his brother to not have to live anymore. It gets to points like that. And then there's a second book that comes out that's about the brother's perspective. He's like really intelligent, like a Stephen Hawking's type, and he just can't express himself. And hearing like the dad that ran away and comes back, and just what the dad's experience and perspective is, like, I need someone, I had to leave because I can't take care of you. it breaks me down every single time. That'll put some tears on you. And I mean, I was like 16 years old reading that. I was like, dude, I'm crying. I don't even have a kid. And it's kind of like when you start to examine that, I mean, obviously a family that doesn't want to deal with it could just be seen as like, oh, they sent them away because they don't want to be the ones that has to take care of them. Sure. But there's also the perspective as well, too, of the people that breaks their heart that they have to. And hopefully those people as well are also keeping up with what is going on with their kid when they are being sent away, which in some cases, some people just send like, here you go, and then kind of just don't deal with it, even though they might still have love for them. That's kind of important as well, too. But I think there is a large amount of like, what do you do when you have something that you can't handle? That's my biggest fear. If I have a kid with a disability, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to, I don't want to mess up or anything of that sort. And then I don't know how. I give people, my best friend has a kid with a disability. I give him all the credit and respect in the world because he's doing something I could possibly never do.
It's really hard. I think we always have to have empathy for the past. It's really easy to judge the past, and sometimes it should be judged. But I think there's also, moments of empathy where you imagine a family, that's just barely getting by. There's no social support systems in the 19th century, and you have a family member who has severe symptoms, severe illness, and you don't know what to do. And so you send them to an asylum because that's what the doctors and the institutions, the government are telling you should do. Sometimes it is done out of shame, but sometimes it's done out of love. I think the best examples for that actually I found at Broadmoor. So Broadmoor is the criminal lunatic asylum that they set up in the 1860s. So everybody in Broadmoor has been convicted of a crime or was found not fit to plead. And so they are, these are the criminal lunatic asylum. You still get letters from their family members writing, asking after them, even if sometimes that violence was done to a member of the family. You have them writing these kind of sad letters, even after they've died, saying, I want to make sure he doesn't, he has a proper burial. I want to make sure that flowers are sent to his grave. Those ties don't go away in the face of illness or even in the face of absence.
Amy, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. I know we kind of covered the wide spectrum there, but I really do appreciate it. And I know I'm happy you taught me a little bit as well too, because like I said, I'm very new to. I know more about modern and maybe a little bit about the past, especially around the lobotomy times. But before that, I have no knowledge whatsoever in that. And if you have a place where people can find your links and any books you'd like to promote as well too.
Sure. Luckily, with a name like Amy Milne-Smith, I'm really easy to find. I think I'm the only one. And I have a personal website where you can also see some of the records I've been doing, transcribing lately of soldiers in the 19th century. That's what my next project I'm looking at, before shell shock. How did people understand war and trauma and mental illness? And I have a recent book out with Manchester University Press, Out of His Mind, hopefully in books, libraries, frankly, in libraries near you. If it comes out in paperback, maybe in a bookstore or two. But thank you again for the opportunity. It's always fascinating to talk. And I like the freewheeling conversations.
It's the only thing I'm good at, but I'm going to link all your links in the description, and I appreciate the time. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of the Blank Podcast.